Today we are going to cover civil rights in the United States. We will define what civil rights are, discuss the civil rights of African Americans, and the politics of black civil rights. First, let's discuss a modern day civil rights issue. Following September 11, 2001, the U.S. began to look at Middle Eastern men suspiciously. This led to efforts to use racial profiling in airport security protocols. Racial profiling is when race or ethnicity are used to are used as a primary criterion for identifying a suspect. Calls to use racial profiling were stifled when the Department of Transportation prohibited screeners from giving travelers special attention solely based on race, color, national origin, religion, sex, or ancestry. This is why airport security seemingly randomly pulls people out of line for more in depth security checks. The US has used mostly random security in airport security, but there has been discussion of using risk based assessment. In risk based assessment, passengers would go through extra screening procedures based on their calculated risk for terrorist activities. The problem with this, of course, is that it introduces the strong possibility of racial profiling. The argument in favor of it is that it may lead to more secure airports. Before diving into the history of civil rights in the US, we need to understand what civil rights and civil liberties are. These terms are often used interchangeably. Outside of this course, that is mostly fine. However, you should understand that civil rights are different from civil liberties. Civil liberties are the Constitution's protections from government power, meaning that the government may not take away these freedoms. Civil liberties include freedom of speech and the right to privacy. Civil rights represent those protections by the government or that the government secures on behalf of its citizens. A good way to understand the difference is to think of civil rights as something that requires government action to protect the rights of citizens, and civil liberties as being well served when the government does nothing. The U.S. has a dark history of violating the civil rights of African Americans. Dominant white majorities in the South institutionalized slavery and later institutionalized segregation. In Federalist Number 10, Madison argued that a diverse national community would be less inclined than state level majorities to engage in tyranny and would be more likely to halt it. This was an argument in favor of federalism. History has shown some support for this argument. When left to their own devices, certain states have passed laws that violate the rights of minorities. National policy historically has worked to prevent states from oppressing minority populations. There are two major obstacles to securing the rights of African Americans. First, the Constitution reserves important authority for the states, such as the power to determine voter eligibility. Separation of powers in the Constitution also makes it difficult for national majorities to control the federal government to the extent required to strike against the tyranny of the states. Second, factions act in self interest and are unlikely to take action without expected return. In 1807, Congress passed a law ending the importation of slaves. Southern representatives did not fight the law, some anticipating that the restricted supply of new slaves would drive up the market value of their human property. In 1819, the Missouri Compromise matched the addition of a slave state with the addition of a free state to maintain the balance of representation in the Senate. The South realized that this strategy would not work in the long term as territories and in the North and the West were to become states. Abolitionists in the North became more vocal about their opposition to the containment strategy. David Wilmot, a Democratic representative from Pennsylvania, introduced a bill that would ban slavery in recently acquired territories. He made the argument that slave labor suppressed the wages of white labor. In 1850, the South agreed to admit California, losing its ability to block legislation in the Senate. However, they did so under the condition that the fugitive slave law, compelling Northerners to honor Southerners' property claims to slaves, be adopted. In Dred Scott v. Sanford, the Supreme Court ruled that the federal government could not prevent slavery in the territories. The Constitution was amended during the Reconstruction period. The 13th Amendment emancipated the slaves. The 14th Amendment granted former slaves citizenship. The 15th Amendment guaranteed them the right to vote. Still, African Americans were blocked from exercising their right to vote in the states. The era of Reconstruction was followed by the era of Jim Crow and segregation. Jim Crow laws were adopted throughout the South to disenfranchise black citizens and physically separate African Americans from whites. As part of Jim Crow, states had the white primary. These were primary elections that only whites could vote in. Poll taxes were levied on all registered voters and typically paid months before the election. They disadvantaged African American voters who tended to be poorer than whites. Literacy tests were administered to stop African Americans from voting. They were not basic literacy tests. They required readers to interpret complicated language from law. During this era, the Supreme Court ruled in Plessy v. Ferguson that Jim Crow laws were legal, and this ruling established the separate but equal doctrine. Prior to the 1930s, African Americans had historically supported the Republican Party because of emancipation and Reconstruction. A shift began after the Republican Party resided over the worst depression in American history. The Democratic Party started embracing African American rights and voters. This was at the risk of losing the Solid South, which represented the political stronghold that the Democrats had over states in the South. The New Deal appealed to African Americans, though Roosevelt did not fight the South on some racial issues because it was not politically wise. In Brown v. Board of Education, the Supreme Court ruled that education is the foundation of good citizenship and thus it is a right, and that it must be available on equal terms. Separate education facilities were ruled to be inherently unequal. This ruling ended the separate but equal doctrine. As you can see from the 1944 electoral map, President Roosevelt successfully kept the states in the South from defecting to the Republican Party and built a broad New Deal coalition. Eventually, Democrats would lose support in the South as they pushed for more civil rights reforms. Next time, we will cover the 1960s to the present. Be sure to check out part 2 of this presentation on civil rights.